surprised that Levi is also on this paper. And it's not random. So I think this presenter will have a bit of battery problems, so I might change it throughout the presentation. So as you can see in the title, it's Evolution Overnight, Party Identification and Heritability. I think after the first two slides, it will be clear why we chose this title, and it's just halfway a prank on evolutionary psychologists. So, Levi already mentioned a couple of things about this field, but 2005 was a milestone in this sense because the APSRPs came out, and afterwards it raised quite a lot of exposure to this sort of analysis for political traits. However, it also raised quite a lot of controversies. It's not just the substantive part, it's also the methodological part. However, since then, quite a lot of work has been done in this field. So political scientists, or halfway political scientists and behavior geneticists, started looking at political traits. So they looked at traits that are interesting for political scientists, and I consider myself a wannabe political scientist, so at least partially interesting for me. It is about human behavior, so it was essential to go through this step, and afterwards there was quite a lot of data that was available to extend the analysis on previous social attitudes, and you can see that ideology, strength of partisanship, political efficacy, in a way, political information and so on were the general traits that were considered to be interesting for this sort of analysis, and the results show a heritable component. And as Levi said, and this is also this misunderstanding of what heritability means. So this is not this deterministic approach that you were born with something and then that will never change. So that was also the part of the critiques. And afterwards, in these 6 or 7 years, you can also see that most of these papers try to go into much deeper theoretical points. They try to make and actually present the mechanisms or the possible paths that we find this sort of relationship. So it's not, the only implication is not that something is heritable, it's more like the effort to make sense what this means and through which paths you can actually interpret the result. And mostly twin studies are used, however there are other methodologies and they show conclusive evidence in this sense. But there was one exception, and this is the GRE style of putting the whole thing. So is the strength of partisanship, which was found to be heritable, as denomination to religiosity, which was found to be also heritable. And this is from Settle et al. Piece 2009, I think it's Political Research Quarterly or something like that, which is that, namely party identification. This is one of the quotes I like because they use this sort of analogy to say why we find that strength of partisanship is heritable, but we find no such evidence for party identification. And indeed, this was replicated on quite a lot of data sets and in very many contexts, and nobody really found substantive and magnitude-wise important and significant genetic effect when it came to party identification. And I think that was a good news for those people who were very skeptical about this sort of research, because it's an overwhelming finding in this way. And in 2009, the new data came out from Minnesota, this Minnesota Political Twin Study, which was actually designed to get as many traits as possible that are informative for political scientists from a sample that was a twin sample. And we ran the same analysis that Levi presented, the ACE models. Generally looking at the sample, what we find that it's a huge heritability component for party identification, and this was previously not found in the literature. Moreover, there was quite substantial effort of demonstrating why we do not find this, because we shouldn't even expect that we find this. And this is, I just mentioned here, it's a 5-category party identification. This is a US sample, so strong Democrats, weak Democrats, independents, weak Republicans, and strong Republicans. And obviously when we saw these numbers, and this is a relatively, on one hand, it's a very stable estimate, plus we can also see that 61% of this variation is, by magnitude, it's substantial. So we started thinking, basically you cannot replicate the previous findings, and then you know that this Minnesota Political Twin Study also has a couple of very specific, particular, I don't know, covariates that don't vary as we should expect. So it is a Minnesota sample as first, and then you have an age group problem. It is a 8 or 9 years period for the age of the people who are included. This is a matter of data collection. So our question was very simple. Is this new finding due to the fact that this sample has some sort of specific irregularities compared to the previous samples that were used to carry out the same analysis, or we really need to sit down and think about this more carefully, and what could be the implication of this, and what could be the path of this heritability. So we can do this by checking all these problematic things. So first of all, it was 2008. The previous studies that found no effect were from 2008, so it's obviously one of the first options that we should look at. It's the age group effect. As I said, it's 9 years, basically I think 8-9 years, and then you have the cohort effect. So these people were from the same cohort. This cohort, they were basically around, I don't know, around between 53 and 60 years or something like that. So it was a relatively old sample when it comes to that, and obviously it was from Minnesota. So what we said, we can use secondary data sources. One of them is the American National Election Studies. For this, we can check the first aspects, the first 3 aspects, and afterwards we use the Annenberg study because it had a huge and representative sample for actually each state, and including Minnesota. So we don't have a problem of observations. Now, if these aspects show this sort of deviating pattern, then we might have a hunch what's going on and why do we find this anomaly. If not, then we should seriously try discussing what's happening. So it's 2008. How special was it? It wasn't. I mean, this is just a simple frequency plot, and the only thing that would pop, that would be interesting if you would stare more on this than you should, is that after 2000 you have a bit of change in trends. You will have more strong party identifiers than weak party identifiers. Otherwise, nothing else is happening here, so I'll just go because this is more interesting. So the other thing is that we know that partisanship is highly correlated with ideology. Some people would claim that we know that ideology comes first. I'm yet not interested to make such a claim. So we started looking at correlations between ideology and partisanship, and we see that there is some sort of fluctuation. At 1990 there is this huge, basically minimum point when it comes to this simple bivariate correlations. Actually, it is funny because one of the twin studies on which people found no effect was collected around this time. But afterwards we see that 2008 is not that special. So the correlation between ideology and partisanship is not deviating from this whole trend that we could see before. And you will see in a bit why this is important. And of course we plotted also to see the percentage of conservative Democrats and to see the percentage of more liberal Republicans. And you can see that in 2004 there was the minimum, but it's going up closer to the overall average. And this is important because it was a rather specific election in 2008. Now afterwards we started doing some multivariate analysis, and here we actually plot ideology and party identification, and this is an interaction term where we allow for nonlinearity, and the differences are not really that significant. I would say that there are no real differences in the trends that you can see. It's a bit, if you look at 2008, there is more strength, so 0 is one of the things, and 3 is the independence. This is strong Democrats, this is weak Democrats, leaning Democrats, and vice versa. So you can see that here we're a bit lower, with a bit of more uncertainty, but this is sample size, and nothing really works out. So it's not really this super special event that was 2008. So what could be the other reason? Age group or cohort effects, and sorry for the colors, but it's just the automated version. So you can see and these are mostly the age group and the cohort that we're interested in. So you can see that, and I think for this, this is not a surprising finding. There is literature stating that as you get older, the identification of party identification gets stronger. So we actually can see that these are the strong Democrats, and these are basically the strong Republicans. So there is an increase, steady increase, and we can see that for this age group that we have in our twin sample, it is a bit higher, generally the percentage of strong identifiers compared to younger age groups. But that is something normal. So we should take this into consideration. We find no specific cohort effect, so it follows the reverse trend. There is nothing specific based on when these people were born or maybe what sort of experiences they were exposed to. And here again the multivariate sort of modeling. I don't go exactly on what the model was or how it was specified. I mean, if there are questions, without a problem. So we find that it is a bit stronger identification on average when it comes to partisanship, and a bit stronger relationship between between ideology and party ID. However, this is mostly reflected here, so there is a higher conversion rate between those people who consider themselves very liberal into marking themselves as strong Democrats than compared to this non-Minnesota age groups or Minnesota Twin Study age groups or cohorts. But then the last thing is Minnesota, because some people say that Minnesota is not really something that a state that is on average. But for this we used another data source. This is just a simple table, although I hate that I had no time to put it in a figure, and I do not want to put in the effort because there's absolutely no finding here. So the thing is that you can see that these percentages line up relatively nicely compared to all other states if you think about them as a baseline category. And we also selected only the Minnesota Twin, that specific cohort that was in our sample, and the difference is, yet again, for that specific cohorts, other states compared to Minnesota, they're not that big. And we went also to do the multivariate analysis, focusing on the ideology. And yet again, we see the same as we saw when it came to age group. It's a higher correlation between ideology and party identification, and a bit more likelihood to actually be a strong identifier. We ran some multinomial probit models, multinomial logic models actually, and there is a relatively statistically significant effect. So if you are in Minnesota, it is more probable that you will be a strong Democrat, for example, than compared to all other states. Then if we would look at this relationship in all other states. So we find this sort of indications which are valuable because on one hand we know that their ideology is correlated with party identification. We know that ideology is heritable, so at least we know where to start looking for possible problems. And then the strong identification, that is something that yet we do not handle in this paper. So we should do this Skoleski decomposition, and now we switch using the Minnesota Twin study back. So this was the slide. I think it's slightly better looking than Levi's, but this is the ACE model where we use the information that we actually have, which is the correlation between the common environment and the different correlations for MZs and DZs. So basically we're just using this this sort of information to understand the variance structure in a given phenotype. In our case, it was first the ideology, first the partisanship. Now we can extend this model, and this is the bivariate Skoleski model. Note this is only for one twin. So you have ideology, and here we actually make the assumption that ideology comes first. So in these Skoleski models, order matters. Here is party identification, which is our dependent variable in a classical sense. And you can decompose the variance in all of them separately. However, you can actually check whether those components that came from ideology have some sort of influence on our second phenotype, which is party identification. Basically, we are looking at the covariation between these two, and how this covariation can be decomposed in these components. And this will reflect the residual. So what happens if we, in the regression term, it would be what happens if we control for ideology, but afterwards look at it much more in detail. What do we find? First of all, if you go back, you can see that this is related to the covariation, these paths that lead from A1 to basically the second phenotype. It really depends what is the correlation between the two phenotypes. So there are some papers and there are some analyses finding huge paths here, but the correlation is 0.2. Well, it's not academic what would be the interpretation of that finding, but it's not that much. So we need to be careful how much of the covariation are we talking about, and we see that it's 0.65, which is a bit higher than on average in other US states, but ideology correlates nicely and highly with party identification. So we find that actually 65.8% is genetic covariation between the two. So our A1 is working quite well. I mean, the thing is that these are percentages that are calculated between from percentages and covariation. So it's not that intuitive to see how big it is. But you can see that it adds up basically to 100%, and this is E. This is the, well, unique environment and unique environment combined with error. But the important finding here is that from this 0.6 correlation that is between party identification and ideology, we actually 65.8% is genetic covariation. If this would have been basically an interesting finding, however, we still have residual variation. Residual genetic effect on party ID, which is here this A2. Now, the whole residual that we had was like 50% of the variance in party identification was not explained. So from that 55% of the unexplained variance, 26.1% is genetic, so it's the A. Now, if this would have been 0, then we would conclude our paper and say that we're finding something that is the artifact, and the artifact is generated by the fact that there is a stronger relationship between ideology and partisanship in that given context that we're analyzing in that Minnesota 2008-2009 study. This is not the case. I mean, the thing is that 26% of this 55% might not seem that much, but it's highly significant. I did not put in here the confidence intervals, but we're only reporting significant results, so this is why I did not make this differentiation. And you can see that there's also the residual environmental effect. Now the thing is that we still have unexplained in the sense of we do not really know why we're seeing this, but there is some sort of genetic effect on party identification which was previously not found, and we find this even if we control for ideology, that's one thing, plus even if we account or check all the possible disturbances in that restrained Minnesota sample. So what are the conclusions? Still residual A, as I said, but ideology actually, and the relationship between ideology and partisanship is accounts for quite a lot of our interpretation why we found that party ID is heritable in this case. Now, we need to look at additional differences, and we're already discussing about this. This is I think this is the first and only twin study that was collected very close to the elections. So all the other data stems from an environment that is not overloaded by politics, where maybe the conversion rate between ideology and partisanship is less. So there could be that because of the campaign situation, things are activated, and this generates our findings. Now this would be interesting because that would be yet again a sort of environmental interaction or some sort of very specific environmental effect on what we find on these results. And we need to extend to check at least education and income, but these will be also in the same direction as there is a restrained age group in our sample. And then we should look at more possible covariates or more possible individual variables in that data set, and to see how they relate to the average or representative US samples. But so far I just presented what we did, and yet again it's not really the specificity of that sample because we have some residual variance. However, what we find in that very, very particular 2008 Minnesota constellation drives some of the findings. And the findings are namely that party identification is heritable.